Well, welcome to World War II Part 7, and on this part, at 5:35 a.m. on the morning of 10th of May, the Germans, who had readied their attack plans, launched their official invasion and assault on France and the Low Countries. So the German airborne assault on the Low Countries was launched at dawn on the 10th of May. Okay, it was aimed at key sectors at Dutch front, on the Albert Canal bridges and at Fort Ibn Email. Okay, and its effect was not limited to significant strategic advantages for General Bock's Army Group B. Because of their sensational nature, the airborne attack simply helped to foster in the Allied mind that the attack was coming in the way they thought. The main thrust of the German army was coming through Holland and Belgium, which was now incorrect due to the plan of Erich von Manstein. But the large airborne assault from paratroopers and the German army attacking the Low Countries simply fixed in the Allied mind that they were right on their premonition that the main German attack was coming through the Low Countries, which of course it was not. The attack were made up at 7th Airborne Division, a Luftwaffe unit, and by the 22nd Infantry Division, an Army Airborne Division that was equipped with troops and equipment suited to a variety of missions. They had the all-important air support of Kesselring's Luftflotte 2 air fleet. The 22nd Division had to take The Hague and, if possible, obtain the submission and cooperation of the Dutch Crown. And he was expecting to have to request an audience from Queen Wilhelmina. The divisional commander, General Graf von Sponeck, set out in full cross-dress uniform. He assumed that once the attack went in, that the Dutch royalty would request an audience at which they would surrender. The division's plan was to take multiple airfields, Valkenburg, amongst other areas south of The Hague, and close in on the capital from there. But the Dutch First Corps, first in the North Sea, had been alerted in time to the incoming attack. A furious battle ensued in which 22nd Division lost the airfields, which had been surprised at paratroops. Sponeck himself was wounded, and by late evening 1,000 German prisoners were being shipped off to England, from the North Sea port of Jamuden. The 7th Airborne Division, however, had much better luck. Its troops occupied part of Rotterdam and Walhaven Airport and held their positions in face of Dutch counterattacks, thanks to close support of the aircraft of Luftwaffe Force Number 2. At Dordrecht, the Germans held both banks of the Maar, although some troops had been dropped in the wrong places. Above all, they'd taken the Moerdijk bridges across the Maar estuary and so prevented their destruction. The 7th Airborne Division, meanwhile, had therefore cleared a corridor which gave the German 18th Army access to the Dutch vesting Holland. But would 18th Army be able to get to Moerdijk before the spearheads at French 7th Army? You see, as I highlighted, the French and British were planning on the Germans coming through the Low Countries, so they had armies there ready to move as soon as the German attack commenced. So in Holland, it was a race against time against the no doubt forward-rushing French and British armies. At dawn on 10th of May, the Dutch post guarding the bridge at Gennep spotted a patrol of Dutch uniformed soldiers escorting a handful of German deserters. When the little column reached the bridge, it opened fire on the Dutch guards and captured it. The men were all members of the Brandenburg detachment, specifically trained for this sort of mission, and this kind of tactic would also be used in the Ardennes campaign in 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, where the Germans got English and American-speaking Germans, dressed them up in GI uniforms to change signs, blow bridges up, damage communications, cause all kind of mayhem. So this is a tactic we'll also see later in the war. Now, however, the success at Gennep opened the road, for the German 18th Army headed by the 9th Panzer Division. Dutch resistance was strong in some places and weak in others. It was tougher on the Greb line, defended by the 2nd and 4th Dutch Corps, than on the Peel line, where the 3rd Corps, as I've already mentioned, had only intended to slow down the German advance before falling back. The Corps' withdrawal, although an orderly one, left the 1st Mechanised Division, the vanguard of Girard's French 7th Army, exposed. Girard's position had deteriorated even more by evening of May 11th, but Belgium Army in his right flank was abandoning the Albert Canal and preparing to withdraw to the Antwerp-Louvain line. And by evening of May the 12th, the 9th Panzer Division had made contact with troops at 7th Airborne Division holding the earlier mentioned bridges. So by May 13th, the situation along the Dutch front had become so grave that Queen Wilhelmina and her government had resigned themselves to the fact that they would have to leave the country. they appealed to Britain for help but got no results and could not have done. Britain already had the BEF advancing into Belgium. Other British forces were in England. They really could do nothing. It would have been unwise for the RAF to fly across the English Channel and fight at their extended range, whereas the German planes were more fueled and fresh. So really, Britain could do nothing, okay? Britain could do nothing, nor could France do nothing. They were too far south at this point. The speed of the German attack was basically one of absolute shock and awe. The Allies were totally not ready for it, even though they kind of knew it was coming in a way. On afternoon of May 14th, the notorious horror raid on Rotterdam took place. The bombers came at the moment when the Dutch and Germans were parleying for surrender at City. So they were discussing the surrender of Rotterdam, but in came the Luftwaffe, okay? In came the Luftwaffe, unable to be reached by the German Panzer Corps commander prior to the attack, and it resulted in some 25,000 homes and buildings being razed and 78,000 made homeless, with a lot of casualties as well. So an absolute terror attack, similar to the treatment that Warsaw got during the invasion of Poland, when, like I said, Hitler, due to troops being there, declared it a fortified city, meaning it was not a free civilian city, so the Luftwaffe could bomb it, a similar kind of thing. Considering the situation that Dutch troops who had been forced back from the Greb line and determined to spare Utrecht from Rotterdam's fate, General Winkelmann made the decision to surrender. He surrendered a number of his remaining soldiers. He'd already lost over 2,000 killed and over 2,000 wounded in the initial fighting with German forces. He signed the instrument of capitulation at 9:30 hours on May the 15th, okay, only surrendering the forces under his direct orders, okay, which accepted Zeeland, but Queen Wilhelmina and Dutch government continued the struggle in exile, giving the Western Allies the benefit of Dutch colonies and their resources, a merchant fleet of nearly 3 million tons of shipping, and a well-trained and battle-worthy warship of numbering types from the Dutch fleet. Now, at the time when General Winkelmann ordered the ceasefire, the Belgian army was preparing to give battle without further retreat, okay? The Belgian army was now in position, ready to fight, okay? They'd fallen back to the Dial line, okay, agreed in earlier discussions on the defensive plan come the German attack between King Leopold and Gamelin of France. It's true that Belgian resistance along Albert Canal had lasted barely 48 hours instead of the 4 or 5 days hoped for by the Belgian government and the Allied High Command. They hoped that they would be able to hold the Germans for nearly a week, but actually in 2 days there was no holding them. So that gave the French and British armies less time to get their full defensive plan into operation. But there were no connection between surprise attacks, okay, and the disaster on the Meuse on May 15th. Really, the Western Allies had no idea what was coming, but it would come soon. Now, at dawn the 10th, okay, also at the fort of Iban Email, okay, massive fortress, armoured fortress, okay, the Belgium 7th Division was holding the line on the Albert Canal with the right flank anchored by its fortified complex of Iban Email, which was armed with 220mm guns and 16 75mm guns in armoured turrets and casemates, etc. Now, basically, there was worry about sabotage, okay, of the canal bridges, but basically it seemed that the Belgians were going to fight rather than sabotage and retreat. Now, the key factor in daring enterprise, okay, was the glider, okay. Paratroops would not have been able to land directly on their objectives as they did on the Dutch airfields, and in any case, time they needed to redeploy them would have given the Belgian defenders plenty of warning of the attack. So for these reasons, a special detachment of 42 gliders have been formed under command of Captain Walter Koch, okay, made up of 424 men, including pilots. For months this unit had gone through extensive training, okay. On left bank at Canal, the gliders at Koch's department landed right in the middle at defences covering the bridges at Vroonhoven and elsewhere, profiting from confusion caused by appearance of these unfamiliar aircraft, which had seemed to be the Belgians, to be ordinary types. The Germans cut the cables to bridges, demolition charges, as well as the telephone lines, and threw the explosive charges into the canal, okay? So there were pre-planned explosive charges there, but the Germans were able to whip them off the bridges in time, and thus the bridges could not be demolished. Now, at Cannes, okay, however, where terrain prevented such an accurate landing, the Belgians had time to blow up the bridge and then inflict heavy losses on Germans. Meanwhile, 11 gliders had landed on top of Fort Iban Email. 78 28 assault pioneers equipped with 2.5 tons of explosives set about the turrets and casemates of the fort, according to plans which had been worked out in great detail and rehearsed 100 times over the months preceding the attack. Unlike the Maginot Line, Ardennes was not protected by outer works, and within minutes many of its strong points had been neutralised by the explosive charges laid by the Germans, and also explosive charges thrown into the gun slits or, by hollow charge blocks applied to the armour. Deployed along a front of 11.25 miles, the Belgian 7th Division was unable to launch any prompt counterattacks, against the bridges won by Koch's detachment. Interestingly, 11.25 miles for one division is a huge line of front. Okay, the Belgians fought as best they could, but they could not prevent the Germans from bringing in reinforcements as planned over the bridges that they had stopped being demolished. Now, in the morning, machine gun sections were parachuted in, and about noon, the advanced units at 4th Panzer Division, made contact. The latter had found the Maastricht bridges destroyed and had crossed the Maar as best they could. Now, at 5:30 hours on May 11th, the German pioneers opened a first 16-ton bridge to traffic, which accelerated the arrival of the 4th Panzer Division and the 16th Panzer Corps, which was the spearhead of the German 6th Army under Richelieu. Toward noon of the same day, rendered helpless by neutralisation of its guns, the garrison at Fort Ardennes surrendered to the 51st Pioneer Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Mikosch, and by evening the Belgian 7th Division was completely out of the battle. They were finished as a battle-ready unit. These events forced King Leopold to issue the withdrawal order already mentioned. The Allies launched repeated airstrikes against the Albert Canal bridges, the destruction of which would have cut off the bulk of Richelieu's advanced units. But the fighters and anti-aircraft batteries at Luftwaffe guarded their charge as well. They were unable to destroy the bridges, and over those 2 days, May 11th and May 12th, 39 Belgian, French and British bombers were shot down. 17 were badly damaged, and 11 were damaged beyond repair, and the Allies had done no damage to the bridges. The Belgian retreat caused a certain number of incidents, of which the most unpleasant centred around the defence of Louvain, a disagreement between the commander of the Belgian 10th Division and Major General B.L. Montgomery, commanding the British 3rd Division. So despite all this initial shock and awe from the paratroop attacks in Holland, and now Ardennes fought under crucial crossings being taken so quickly within a few days by the Germans, the Allies were now proceeding plan. Now, the Allies felt at the moment that their position was improving each day. French and British troops were in position. Some were advancing, ready to support the Belgians more directly. They couldn't get to the Dutch in time, and they thought that their plan was going well, but they were not ready for what would happen in the Ardennes sector. Now, as the one Allied commander stated, our position improves day by day, our ranks are tightening. In the decisive days which lie ahead, do not spare yourselves, suffer every sacrifice to halt the invasion. And as on the year in 1914, the French and British troops are relying on us, the safety and honour of the country demand it. At 6:30 hours, on May 10th, Captain Beaufort, reported to Gamelin at Vincennes. The latter were about to set in motion the complicated Dial-Breda manoeuvre, swinging the First Army Group into the Low Countries, a plan which would involve 5 armies, which counted a total of 41 divisions, which totaled about 600,000 men. This was the Gamelin manoeuvre of moving French-British forces into Belgium. Beaufort found Gamelin in an optimistic mood, pacing up and down the corridors at barracks, humming audibly. But that would not last long when the news of the real German attack came, because all of these offensives in Holland and Belgium, they were simply the lure, to lure the French and British into Belgium and the Low Countries, ready for the Ardennes offensive, which would catch them out in a very, very bad way indeed. So although the Belgians' retreat to Antwerp-Louvain line was justified, it had been made earlier than envisaged, which meant that during the Allied advance into Belgium, the brunt fell upon General Prieux's cavalry corps for a few days. The corps consisted of 2nd and 3rd Light Mechanised divisions, and on the 13th, the cavalry corps came to grips with the 16th Panzer Corps. So a cavalry corps, of the French army had to face a Panzer Corps on the Liège-Namur road. Now, it is claimed that armoured units at 3rd Light Mechanised Division, mainly engaged with 4th Panzer Division, showed inferior manoeuvrability. Furthermore, Major General Staver's orders were transmitted more efficiently than those of General Bougrain. But by morning at 15th of May, the French First Army, thanks to delay in actions fought by the Cavalry Corps, was in position between Namur and Wavre, with 6 divisions in the line and 1 in reserve. So here it underwent the full assault of the German 6th Army, heavy Stuka attacks, heavy air attacks, of course spearheaded by the Panzers. Headed and spearheaded by Panzers, so the Germans were held and indeed repulsed in a number of ways by French 4th Corps under General Amis. Now at 16:30 on that day, Richelieu called off his troops, planning to resume his advance with a more orthodox set-piece attack. Meanwhile, Richelieu's 11th Corps tried to rush Louvain, but the German troops were promptly flung out by a timely counter-attack by the British 3rd Division under General Montgomery. All in all, north of Namur, the Allies had the best of May 15th. But to the south at Sedan, matters were altogether different, causing Gort and Blanchard to issue orders for a retreat on the evening of the 15th. So success at Dial manoeuvre, depending on the firm holding at Allied centre by French 2nd and 9th Armies, which took west of Longuyon and south of Namur, blocked the exits from the Ardennes and held line of the Meuse. All Huntzeiger's 2nd Army had to do was to hold the positions which it had occupied since September 1939 from Sedan to Givet. The same applied to Korap's 9th Army, but his left and centre had to advance from the Rocroi-Fourmier region and take up defensive positions along the Belgium Meuse between Givet and Namur. So the pieces are in place, the French armies are moving in, setting up their defensive positions. It was what it was. So on morning at 10th, the Ardennes. On the morning at 10th, Korap and Huntzeiger sent their cavalry divisions across the French-Belgian border into the Ardennes to act as a screen while the 9th Army took up its new position. Little did they realise that the Ardennes was going to be the main spearhead of the main German panzer forces. So, what happened on this day then? The light divisions, suddenly came under attack from numerous German tank formations near Arlon and had to fall back. On the 11th, several cavalry engagements confirmed that the Germans were making a major effort in the Ardennes region. Previously thought of as, like I said in part 6, impassable. And they only thought that they would be able to launch like light infantry, no motorised or panzer divisions, But the 2nd and 5th light cavalry divisions were thrown back from the area with heavy losses, and Korap was obliged to withdraw his cavalry to the left bank of the river Meuse. The impression gained from these skirmishes were conveyed by air observations, and it says basically their conclusion was the enemy seems to be preparing an energetic thrust in the direction of Givet. Now, advancing against the 4 French light cavalry divisions and 2 cavalry brigades with their estimated 300 tanks and armoured cars were no less than 7 full panzer divisions, totaling nearly 2,300 armed vehicles. So, as I showed when I went through the breakdown of forces, 7 of the 10 panzer divisions were in this area. They were the sledgehammer that had punched through the lines there and then drive for the Channel under General Erich von Manstein's new plan to replace the old plan. So they'd attacked Holland and the Low Countries. Holland were paratroops and infantry and motorised divisions. Belgium was now obviously being invaded. The French and British had begun their plan of moving into Belgium and forming a defensive line to meet the Germans, and the Germans meanwhile smashed into the Ardennes. So the 300 tanks and the cavalry of the French divisions could not match the 2,300 tanks hitting through the Ardennes. So given these odds, it's hardly surprising that French cavalry units failed to sustain the delay in action for more than 48 hours. I'm amazed they lasted 48 hours. They thought they could last 4 days, but they could not. Within 48 hours they had to retreat, but they did retreat well. They blew up bridges across the River Meuse after they crossed it on the afternoon of May the 12th. And of course, this kind of thing is what the Germans pre-prepped for in the Battle of the Bulge. They went in with the Special Forces units dressed as Americans to make sure that those bridges were not destroyed in that offensive, so it wouldn't slow them down, because the Germans were relying on weather and relying on having the bridges there for speed and momentum, so they obviously learnt from this. Now, on evening of the 7th day, General General Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division reached Hoeks, okay, on the Meuse downstream of Dinant. Urged on by Rommel's enthusiasm, the 7th Motorised Battalion crossed the Wear to the left bank and profited from a small gap between the French 5th Motorised and 18th Divisions to infiltrate, scale the bank and establish a provisional bridgehead. Now, General Beaufort, commanding the 2nd Corps in Collap's army, was well aware of this weakness in his front, but the battalion which he had sent there that afternoon to cover the Wear at Hoeks had completely failed to carry out its orders. It had not arrived, and therefore the Germans were able to cross in this area and establish a bridgehead. Now, Rommel's tiny pocket on the left bank should have been pinched out on the following morning, but under Stuka bombardment, the French infantry failed to coordinate with tanks at 4th Light Cavalry Division, which headed the French counter-attack, and by evening at 13th of May, the enterprising Rommel had gained enough ground for his sappers to begin bridging operations across the river to bring his main tank force across and infantry backing up. So it will be remembered that 7th Panzer Division, together with 5th Panzer Division, following on its tracks, formed Hoth's 15 Panzer Corps, which in return belonged to Klug's 4th Army. Now, during night of May 12th and 13th, the French in its sector of the 102nd Division observed a heavy column of enemy traffic heading for Monthermy, slightly downstream of the junction of the Meuse and the Semoy rivers. So, you know, the Germans are just hitting everywhere now. The main thrust, while Holland is being attacked and while the initial fighting is taking place in Belgium, this huge German attack is now starting to take shape from the Ardennes region into Sedan. So it's all an onrush, all lit up, okay, a French airman said, seeing lights trailing as far as the eye could see, i.e. the German tank and motorised columns. So, the final breakthrough at Sedan very quickly within days of the attack. The 6th and 8th Panzer Divisions, okay, of Reinhardt's, Panzer Corps formed the right hand of Kleist's Panzer Group. They attacked at 1600 hours on May 13th, only to meet furious resistance from machine gunners of the 42nd Colonial Demi Brigade. But all the courage at latter were no substitute for anti-tank guns. The PZKW-4 tanks and self-propelled guns of the Panzer Divisions took up position along the right bank of the Meuse and systematically blasted the French machine gun nests on the opposite bank. So the Germans in this area pretty much used their tanks as artillery, lining them up on the opposing riverbank and just bombarding the hell out of the French machine gun posts and infantry positions on the other side. So when they'd silenced, okay, the machine gun positions on the other bank of the Meuse, a German battalion crossed the Meuse on inflatable rafts and after bloody fighting took the little town of Monthermy, but they could get no further because of sustained resistance and awkward terrain. This setback at Monthermy was, however, largely eclipsed by total victory of Guderian and his Panzer Corps in the Sedan sector. Now, on hearing the alarming reports from the cavalry units, Huntzeiger had committed his reserve, the 71st Division, to assist 10th Corps. On the morning at 13th, the 71st closed up on the right wing of the 55th Division on the Meuse, yet the forces, okay, released by this move had not reached their new sector when Stukas of the 8th Flieger Corps launched a series of intensive attacks, pinning down the French troops where they stood. Now, on May 10th, also at the start of the attack, okay, the 1st Panzer Division in the lead and the 2nd Panzer Division on the right, the 10th Panzer Division on the left had surged forward at dawn. While crossing Belgium-Luxembourg frontier, some time was lost because of determined resistance from the chasseurs Ardennes. But by evening at 11th, Guderian's leading panzers had broken through to the Semoy, having covered 60 miles of territory in just 48 hours. Rapid stuff, under resistance as well. Now, considering delays suffering the 2nd Panzer Division, Guderian had wanted to postpone a further advance from the 13th to 14th, but Kleist, wanting to be sure of a close coordination between two corps, would not agree. So on the 12th of May, Guderian closed up his divisions and agreed with Luftflotte 3rd, okay, on the measures to be taken to ensure the close cooperation between the Luftwaffe and the ground troops. Now, from noon to 1600 hours, the Stukas intensified their attacks, meeting no opposition at all. You know, the French Air Force, British Air Force were at sea. They were not responding in this area at all, giving the Luftwaffe full control of everything going on. So they concentrated the Stukas on the artillery positions at 55th Division, okay, while 8 concentrations of 10.5 centimetre and 15 centimetre guns were pounding a front of 2,700 yards to speed the crossing of Kirchner's 1st Panzer Division. The French emplacements on left bank at Meuse were knocked out one by one by the high-powered punching velocity of the famous 88 anti-aircraft gun, which was an anti-aircraft gun, but also was a fantastic artillery piece and an excellent tank killer, as would be shown in the North African campaign to come. So at 1600 hours, when the French guns covering the Meuse had been silenced, the SS motorised regiment Gross Deutschland, sent to help the 1st Panzer Division, was ferried to the left bank in assault boats with outboard engines and on inflatable rafts, and were flung straight into fray. Now, the resistance at French 55th Division were fluctuating. Some areas it was strong, some areas it was weak, On the whole, however, the badly trained reservists who made up the division broke and fled before German infantry. They were just getting overrun in these concentrated Stuka attacks, artillery attacks, and now infantry crossing the river, shock troops crossing river. So we're still about 1600 hours at Bulsen, 5 miles from Sedan, only 5 miles from Sedan, before any German tanks had crossed the Meuse. Panic spread to a French regiment of heavy artillery and to the rear areas like a forest fire. So news of the massed German Panzer Attack and concentrated assaults already started hitting the divisions immediately in the rear area near Sedan. And guns were blown up, telephone lines were cut, and terrified troops took to their heels and ran. So Guderian actually noted, crossing, said, I was now anxious to take part in the assault across the Meuse by the riflemen. The actual ferrying must be nearly over by now, so I went to St. Menges and from there to Floing, which was proposed crossing place at 1st Panzer Division. I went over the 1st assault boat. On the far bank at river I found the efficient and brave commander of the 1st Rifle Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Balke, and his staff. Basically, the entire operation was a massive success. By midnight, German penetration south of Sedan was deep enough for Guderian sappers to open their bridges to the 19th Panzer Corps heavy vehicles on the right. The forward units of VL's 2nd Panzer Division had been halted in front of Docherny, while on the left, Schall's 10th Panzer Division had only gained a little ground, above Vadelincourt, on the left bank of the Meuse. But the French 55th Division, after fluctuating resistance, some stiff, some weak, had basically been scattered. They found 500 dead. 71st Division was now on brink of destruction, and the French had 80 artillery pieces knocked out already. So the German attack was heavy, consistent, and just was like a tidal wave running over the French forces. So following day, Guderian headed in his corps for Abbeville and the Channel, swinging to west, sending the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions across the River Bar and the Ardennes Canal. Now, Gross Deutschland, and the 10th Panzer Division guarded the flank at German penetration around Stone. And on the 14th and on the 15th of May, an energetic counterattack by the oh God, my arm's gone stiff. I've been sat there talking with my arm bent, it's totally gone stiff. It's getting cramp. I'll be okay. So where was I? On 14th and 15th, an energetic counterattack across rear at 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions by the 3rd Armoured and 3rd Motorised Divisions of Flavigny's 21st Corps would have had a very good chance of restoring the French front along the Meuse, but nothing was done. That was the perfect time when they could have re-established control over a sizable section at Meuse River, but the French army did not move, Flavigny was content to contain the south flank of the pocket. Meanwhile, the German flak gunners defended the Sedan bridges with a high degree of skill. 170 bombers, many of them British, were flung against the bridges in near suicidal missions. 85 of those 170 bombers were shot down, and they had very little damage at all. So it was that the 664 tanks, at 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions, carved through the right flank at French 9th Army. Now, Corop tried to block their path, by stationing his 3rd Brigade at Spahé and his 53rd Division between the Meuse and Poix-Terron. But basically, despite being heroic, they just could not hold down the position. The French troops, some of them reservists, were just not up to the job of facing this attack by a highly trained modern army. Now, at the same time, further to north, the 8th Panzer Division crossed the Meuse, midway between two rivers, shouldering aside the French 61st Division. In sector of the French 11th Corps, French resistance wilted on 14th and collapsed on the 15th of May. For the 5th Panzer Division had followed the 7th Panzer Division across the Meuse Germans and their combined 660 tanks had caught the French 22nd and 18th Divisions in the act of installing themselves along an overstretched front of 23 miles. So while two infantry divisions were lining and trying to establish a defensive position across 23 miles, they got hit by a spearhead of nearly 700 German tanks that hit them like a brick. Now, neither of these two French divisions were motorised, neither of them had more than 12 battalions apiece in line on May 12th, and both had been counting on at least 48 hours to do their full redeployment. But sadly, the near 700 tanks of those two panzer divisions did not give them that time. So the battlefield was a complete head of chaos. You know, some French divisions were fighting bravely, some were collapsing, some were scattering, some were putting up stiff resistance. But this lack of consistency is ultimately what would also aid the Germans. So First Armoured Division only made matters worse. I mean, Bilot had put this division at the disposal of 9th Army. It had 156 tanks, of which 66 of them were the formidable heavy Char B tank, and was prepared to counterattack towards Dinant. But it was surprised while refuelling by the tanks of 15th Panzer Corps and was virtually wiped out. You know, this also characterised a large amount of what went on in the battle for France, because, you know, the French tanks, while numerous, and while the Char B was a very heavy tank with a formidable 75mm gun plus a second gun on it, they were slow and less manoeuvrable, and also, unlike the German panzer divisions, what had been drilled and trained and designed for rapid warfare, you know, they were not. So thus, a French tank division, 156 tanks, were pretty much wiped out. They were caught while refueling. Ridiculous. So technical reason was simple enough. French tanks were laboriously refueled by tankers, while the Germans used smaller, handier jerry cans. So while the French tanks stopped, they'd wait for trucks to pile up, big petrol trucks, gasoline trucks to fill the tanks up. The Germans carried their fuel with them on jerry cans, often attached to the tanks or in trucks. So therefore, as soon as they needed fuel, they could get it and just keep going. And you know, some of these subtle things, you know, gave the German armoured arm a much stronger ability to move. So to cover disastrous events of May 15th, the 4th North African Infantry Division, going to the help of the French 11th Corps, was cut to pieces as well. Now on morning at 16th, the advanced units of the 19th, and the 25th Panzer Corps, thrusting, forwards from Pointe-Aron and from Monthermé, joined hands at Montcornet, deep in the rear of a French Army Corps. Further to north, the 15th Panzer Corps, still subordinated to German 4th Army, crossed the Franco-Belgian frontier near Formiers. In 4 days of battle, the Panzer Group under von Kleist and the 15th Panzer Corps had destroyed 8 full divisions in 4 days of the 9th and 2nd Armies, and had smashed open a breach of 81 miles. You see, 23 of those miles were held by 2 French divisions were destroyed. Another area held by the French tank division, which was caught out by the German panzer column while refueling and subsequently destroyed. So this just left huge holes in the French line around the Ardennes, southern Belgium French frontier, which of course would give the panzers that ability to suddenly stream towards the coast. Now, the breach, through that breach, that had been made of 81 miles, some 2,200 tanks in multiple columns and formations, backed up by armoured cars, and the trucks of the motorised and infantry divisions were now streaming through, and there was no way they could fill that gap. It was just too large of a gap that had been created. You know, the French government and the High Command, were they to blame for relying on a defensive front along the Dial? You know, that had always been the view of Paul Renard, but ultimately this was a disaster. You know, the French were just getting destroyed in the Ardennes sector, overrun. So already, the campaign is just going crazy. The Germans, from switching those initial attacks in Holland and Belgium, suddenly are smashing through the Ardennes. They're catching German French divisions refueling. They've been crossing the canals, seizing bridges, defending those bridges against multiple Allied bomber raids. Everything has gone well for the Germans. And now, through that 81-mile gap, 2,200 German tanks are streaming in multiple columns. So basically, okay, in Allied command already by May the 14th, okay. The atmosphere of the French command areas was that of a family keeping vigil over a dead member, okay. It was said by one French officer, and he said, our front has been pushed in at Sedan, there have been some failures. He fell into an armchair and a sob stifles him. Basically, they were caught completely out of kilter. They were just crazy. Now, all of this, okay, the Germans opening the French lines and everything else suddenly meant that the whole area now ensued into panic. Okay, German columns were coming through everywhere through this gap. The Stukas and the Luftwaffe were still bombing Allied positions, bombing Allied divisions that had not even been involved in the fighting and were not even aware what was going on. The speed of the German attack over those first 4 to 6 days was terrifying. They'd taken all the canals, the forts, the bridges. They were streaming through thousands of tanks, okay, and they could do little. But this panicked people, okay. There were now columns of refugees along all the roads, pulling horse-drawn vehicles, carrying all their possessions. You know, some of them even with no shoes on, getting blistery shoes. I mean, the entire thing, was just a destruction. Now, on May 15th, Bilot, okay, telephoned Georges and made it clear the 9th Army, okay, the French 9th Army was on the brink of catastrophe. It was simply being systematically destroyed. Now, he recommended he be replaced, hopefully, by a better commander who may be able to provide a bit of a psychological boost to the troops of the 9th Army, which was now in complete disarray. Now, on 7:30 a.m. on 15th, Winston Churchill had been jerked from his sleep by the news that Paul Renard was calling him by telephone. Churchill picked up the receiver and received Renard's message, and it said this: "We have been defeated. The front is broken near Sedan. They are pouring through in great numbers with tanks and armoured cars." In his memoirs, Churchill admits that he was unable to recall the precise words used by a French colleague, but he is clear enough about his own reply. Now, all experience shows the offensive will come to an end after a while. I remember the 21st of March 1918, after 5 or 6 days, they had to halt for supplies. You see, even now dealing with the new type of warfare that the Germans had brought in, even now, they thought, well, they have attacked, but you see, like what happened in 1918, you see, they're still thinking along World War I principles. They're still thinking that, like in 1918, the German shock armies had to stop after 5 or 6 days to resupply and re-equip. But this is not 1918. So like I've said through the videos, even now, under attack, with a front collapsing all around the Ardennes, Sedan, southern Belgium regions, they are still under this World War I mentality. And ultimately, this would cost them dearly, because the Germans would indeed not stop. The only way the Germans would stop was simply to regroup. Now, none of this was in Churchill's mind when he arrived in Paris on afternoon of May 16th for a meeting with Renard, Daladier and Gamelin, okay? Now, within 5 minutes, okay, Churchill had been put in picture and convinced at gravity of the situation. Okay, now Churchill then asked them, where is the strategic reserve, okay? Where is your strategic reserve to plug this gap? But, okay, that was not really coming. Okay, so in Gamelin's Breda manoeuvre, the Supreme Commander had ignored the repeated advice of his subordinates, and for political rather than strategic reasons, had committed Girard's 7th Army, which should have formed the main manoeuvre, but had not done so. So basically, you know, forces that should have committed to certain areas, they had not. Now, when first reports of disaster at Sedan came in, General Georges did what he could to restore continuity to Allied front. On the eve at German crossing of the Meuse, he had ordered 4 divisions to head for the threatened sector. Now, the following day, to ease the strain on Bilot, Georges took the 2nd Army under his direct orders and diverted General Touchon's 6th Army, originally intended to cover the Swiss frontier, to head to the Aisne River. Now, on May 17th, General Ferrer, not caught up, was given command of the 7th Army and ordered to re-establish contact with the 9th Army in the region of St. Quentin. Thus, between May 12th and 17th, some 20 divisions were given new orders, which would head them towards the breach in the Allied line. A redeployment, okay, which necessitated smooth running of 500 trains and 30,000 trucks and vehicles, which was not possible and not going to happen. But the plan were ruined at the outset from the Luftwaffe. During the same period, German bombers cut the French railway network in hundreds of places, isolating the sector exposed to the offensive of Panzer Group Kleist. So basically, already predicting a possible French resurgence counterattack in this area, the Germans immediately already had the Luftwaffe with the Stukas bomb the French rail network, utterly making it useless to French trains, and thus the French would not be able to redeploy those units into those sectors at that time. So ends the first part, okay, of War in the West, okay, Part 7, Attack in the West. Coming in Part 8, we will continue on the invasion of France, which will then lead to Britain standing alone. But we will cover more of the attack on France and the follow-up from the fantastic success of Manstein's plan in the Ardennes and into Sedan. We will cover the following parts of the French war in Part 8. So I will leave it there. World War II Part 7 is completed. Coming in Part 8 is the destruction of France and the Low Countries. I'm out.